Rome, April 18th, the year 185 of the Christian era. The morning light has not yet warmed the white marble of the Senate. In the corridors, the murmur of the senators carries the scent of pagan incense and the weight of a decision no one wants to make. In the center of the room, a man in an embroidered toga stands, a scroll in his hands, his eyes fixed upwards, as if reading not to that assembly but to another, invisible, much larger one. He reads slowly, each word chosen with the precision of a philosopher who has spent decades honing the art of argument. When he finishes, the silence lasts too long to be comfortable. No senator responds, no one refutes, no one finds the word to refute what he has said. Then the judge speaks. The sentence is not based on arguments, it is based on a law. An old law from the time of Nero which simply states, whoever professes Christianity and refuses to renounce it, dies. The man could renounce it right now. He would only need to say one sentence. A formality, as the judge himself suggests, already constrained by what he needs to do. The man replies no, that he prefers to die, that something better awaits him. This man's name was Apollonius. He was a Roman senator, and he died on April 18th in the year 185. But here begins something strange, something that history has made sure to record, as if there were an invisible logic operating beneath the centuries. 991 years later, on the 18th of April in the year 1166, a man dressed as a pilgrim crossed the gates of a destroyed city, demolished stone by a furious emperor. He did not flee. He returned. He returned to rebuild what had been destroyed, with empty hands and intact faith. His name was Galdinus, and on that very day he had been consecrated bishop. And 452 years later, on the 18th of April in the year 1618, which was Holy Thursday, a woman lying on a convent bed recited the Psalms in a low voice. She founded monasteries. She raised 6 children. She fought in the court of the most powerful king in Europe. She won. And then she chose to wash clothes. In the end, she was just a talkative nun whom no one recognized in the corridors. Her baptismal name was Barbara. In the convent, they called her Mary of the Incarnation. 3 people, 3 completely different centuries, 3 countries, 3 worlds, 3 ways of life that don't touch each other in any way. Except for one thing, the date on which everything happened. And a secret that all 3 carried, and that in radically different ways cost them everything. To understand this secret, you have to start at the beginning. And the beginning is in Rome. Rome, 2nd century AD. The empire is at its peak. Roads connect the known world from one end to the other. Latin is the language of power. And at the center of it all, in the beating heart of the most sophisticated civilization humanity had ever built, a young senator named Apollonius has a problem that no philosopher can solve for him. He has everything. A noble family, a position in the Senate, a reputation as a man of integrity in an era when integrity was rare. He knows Plato by heart. He knows Aristotle, the Stoics, the Epicureans. He spent years immersed in Greek and Roman philosophy, which promised to teach the path to the good life, to perfect virtue, to the balance of the soul. But the more he studies, the more one question persists unanswered. If philosophical ethics are so perfect, why does no one truly practice them? Why do the same philosophers who discourse on virtue betray their friends, corrupt the courts, and worship gods who behave worse than men? The contradiction bothers him like a pebble in his shoe that no one else seems to notice. One day, Apollonius stumbled upon something he had never seen before: Christians being led to trial. It wasn't the first time Rome had prosecuted Christians, but this time he stopped and observed. What caught his attention was not the spectacle of the persecution, but the behavior of the persecuted. They didn't beg, they didn't negotiate, they didn't feign. Some sang. They died with a serenity that no philosophical school he knew could produce. Philosophy teaches to accept death with resignation. Those people seem to receive it as a prearranged appointment. Curiosity leads him to reading. Apollonius requests the writings of the Christians. He reads the New Testament with the eyes of someone who has spent decades training in the analysis of philosophical texts. Then he goes further. He seeks out Pope Eleutherius himself, the 13th Bishop of Rome. He has a series of long, detailed, intellectual conversations with him. The Pope instructs him in the scriptures, in the doctrines, in the path of faith. And Apollonius, the man who spent his entire life searching for perfect ethics, finds in the gospel what Plato had failed to provide: an embodied ethics. An ethics that was not theory, but person. That demanded not only correct reasoning, but real love. He asks for baptism. In Rome in the year 180, this is no small decision. Emperor Commodus, son of the famous Marcus Aurelius, is personally tolerant of Christians, but the older law, Trajan's law, remains in force. A Christian who confesses his faith when denounced and refuses to renounce it dies. Apollonius knows this. Apollonius, he converts anyway, and he begins to bring others with him. His word, his example, the impeccable logic of one who found the truth after searching for it his whole life. This bothers a lot of people, and it would soon cost him everything. The accusation came from a slave whose name history has not recorded, troubled by the growth of Christianity among the powerful, went to the Praetorian prefect Perennius and pointed out Senator Apollonius. There is a cruel irony in this. The man who converted senators through pure argument was betrayed by someone who probably never heard of him. Perennius conducted the proceedings with unusual care. Apollonius was a senator of impeccable reputation, not some anonymous figure from the catacombs. He submitted to 2 separate hearings, the first with Perennius himself, the second with a group of senators and jurists. In both, he was able to speak without interruption. He savored every second. He drafted an apology, a philosophical text defending Christianity, and read it aloud in plenary session. He systematically dismantled the logical incoherence of the Roman gods. He presented Christian ethics as the only one capable of sustaining a truly just civilization. He argued about life, death, love, and truth with a clarity that made those present exchange silent glances. When it was over, there was no rebuttal. Many were convinced, but conviction and political courage are different things, and no one had the courage to overturn the sentence. Perennius made one last attempt. He proposed resignation as a mere formality, just a public declaration without needing to change anything internally. Apollonius looked at him and said, "I am astonished that, having heard my irrefutable argument, you can still make such an insinuation to me. I am a Christian, not only in word, but in deed. And my greatest desire is to shed my blood in witness to my faith." The condemnation was confirmed by Trajan's law, not by refutation of the arguments, only by decree. As a Roman citizen, Apollonius was entitled to decapitation, an honorable death, without the tortures reserved for non-citizens. Before the execution, he once again refused to recant, and he uttered the last words that Eusebius of Caesarea and Saint Jerome would preserve. "Something better awaits me, eternal life, given to those who lived well on earth." He was beheaded on April 18th of the year 185. The senators who heard him never forgot the silence of that room, and the blood of that philosopher was the seed of many conversions in Rome, Milan, the year 1096. In the streets of the Porta Orientale, where the children of renowned families are born, a child receives the name Galdino, della Sala family, city nobility, not court nobility, the kind of nobility measured in generations of service to the community and not in titles bought with money. Milan, at the beginning of the 12th century, is a city that knows itself to be important. It is at the crossroads of the trade routes of northern Italy. It has its churches, its markets, its pride as a city that has never completely bowed to any lord. Galdino grows up in this environment and enters religious life in the very city where he was born. He doesn't seek prestige in Rome or in famous monasteries. He stays in Milan. He becomes chancellor and archdeacon of the diocese, the administrative and intellectual arm of Archbishop Oberto of Pirovano. They are 2 very different men who build a perfect partnership. Oberto, the spiritual shepherd, Galdino, the strategist who keeps the diocese standing while the world around them crumbles. And the world in that 12th century is indeed falling apart. The problem has a name: Frederick I Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, a man of boundless ambition. To consolidate his dominion over the Church, Frederick places on the throne of St. Peter a pope of his own choosing, whom history would record as the anti-pope Victor IV. The legitimate pope, Alexander III, refuses to yield. Christendom is split in two. On one side, the bishops who follow the emperor and recognize the anti-pope. On the other, those who side with Alexander. Galdino and Oberto side with Alexander, and Milan remains with them. Federico does not forgive. In 1162, imperial troops besieged Milan. What followed was one of the greatest urban destructions of the Middle Ages. The city Galdino had known since childhood, the markets where he had walked, the churches where he had prayed, the streets of the Porta Orientale where he was born, everything was dismantled, burned, and razed, stone by stone. The emperor wanted nothing to remain. He wanted the name of Milan to become nothing more than a memory of defeat. Galdino and Oberto escape. They flee to the legitimate Pope, Alexander III, who at that moment is himself in exile, resisting the same emperor who destroyed Milan. Two exiles who find themselves in the same shelter. Two men without a city, without a diocese, without anything, but with a conviction that Frederick Barbarossa, with all his armies, had not managed to demolish. Do you know anyone who watched everything they built crumble at once and yet still came back? Who didn't give up when the ground disappeared from under their feet? Galdino's story is just beginning. Oberto would die in Benevento, far from home. And with him went the question, who would be able to return to what remained of Milan and start over from scratch? Rome, December 1165. Pope Alexander III summons Galdino to the Eternal City and elevates him to the cardinalate. It is an act of absolute trust. Amidst the chaos of the schism, with three anti-popes being pushed by the emperor to destabilize the church, Alexander chooses Galdino to be the first cardinal Milan has ever had in its entire history. A few months later, Oberto dies. The pope does not hesitate. He appoints Galdino archbishop. He personally consecrates him bishop in Rome on the 18th of April of the year 1166, the same date that, 981 years earlier, had marked the martyrdom of Apollonius, now marks the episcopal birth of Galdino. He sets off for Milan dressed as a pilgrim, without ostentation. The return journey to a destroyed city is not made with pomp. He arrives in September of 1167. He is received at the Basilica of St. Ambrose, whose monks had already recognized Alexander as the legitimate pope. What Galdino finds is not a diocese, it's a camp of ruins. Reconstruction begins with the bricks and extends to the souls. He removes the bishops who had sided with the anti-pope. He supports the Lombard League in its resistance to the emperor and favors the founding of Alexandria, a new city named in honor of the pope. But amidst all this strategy, something distinguishes Galdino from a simple administrator. He never loses sight of the poor. During this period, what the people begin to call the bread of St. Galdino is born. A mobile kitchen that travels the city streets feeding the destitute, along with an association that rescues those imprisoned for debt. Rebuilding a city meant rebuilding each person within it. At the same time, he combats the Cathar heresy, which gains followers among Milanese disillusioned by years of war. The conviction of someone who has already lost everything for a truth and knows exactly its worth. On April 18, 1176, exactly 10 years after his consecration, Galdino ascended the pulpit of the Cathedral of Santa Tecla for the last time. He delivered a fiery sermon against the Cathars. According to the monk Hilarion, biographer and eyewitness, when Galdino finished speaking in the presence of a large crowd, he gave up his spirit to the Lord. He fell dead, at 80 years old, with his last words on his lips. Pope Alexander III canonized him without delay. Galdino became the patron saint of Lombardy. His name entered the litany of the Ambrosian Rite, alongside St. Ambrose and St. Charles Borromeo. He was born in Porta Oriental. He died in service. And the 18th of April, which marked his consecration, also marked his departure. Paris, February 1st, 1566. Barbara Avrillot is born. Her father, Nicolas Avrillot, is Lord of Chamstro, a wealthy landowner, influential at the French court, and a man of unwavering faith. The family has money, position, and a certain kind of piety that is not merely social decoration. It is real. Barbara grows up in this environment of home prayer and practical generosity, and from a very young age feels that religious life is where she belongs. When, as a teenager, she is sent to the Sisters Minor of Our Lady of Humility at the Longchamp convent, this feeling only deepens. She wants to stay, she wants to be a nun, but she's 14 years old and the family says no. She returns home. 2 years later, the family goes beyond saying no and says yes to something else. Pedro Acari, Viscount of Villemort, a man of irreproachable morals, a wealthy landowner, very active in court politics. Barbara is 16 years old. She has no choice. She gets married. Paris knows her as the beautiful Acari, not only for her physical beauty, which is real and noticed by all, but for a presence that is not easily described, a combination of intelligence, grace, and a seriousness of character that makes people seek her advice on everything. Family crises, political decisions, problems of conscience. She's not just the Viscount's wife. She is a point of reference in the city. Within a few years, Barbara has 6 children. She manages the large house, the accounts, the properties. She prays in the intervals between her children, meals, and court visits. She herself would later say that domestic life was her form of asceticism, doing everything with perfection and love, reserving neither time nor prominence for herself. But the world she lives in is not peaceful. Late 16th century France is in religious turmoil. The war between Catholics and Huguenots has torn the country apart. Paris was besieged by Henry IV, who entered the city after converting to Catholicism to seize the throne, but who carried with him a Protestant past that was not forgotten by the most fervent Catholics. Peter Acari was one of them, a member of the Catholic League who resisted until the end. When Henry IV consolidates power, the League is dissolved, and in retaliation, he sends Peter Acari into exile and confiscates all his property. 4 years. 4 years in which Barbara remains in Paris, alone with 6 children, without income, without her husband, and with the family name tarnished by accusations of treason. She does not give up. She goes to court. She argues. She presents evidence. She doesn't stop. She doesn't yield. And in the end, she wins. Peter's honor is restored. The property is returned. The exile ends. She had fought for him with the same determination with which years later she would fight for something infinitely greater. No one in Paris at that moment suspected what was about to happen. Not even Barbara. 1601. Barbara is 35 years old, has 6 children, a husband back from exile, and a life that from the outside seems complete. That is, when she reads a book. The writings of Teresa of Avila. The Spanish Carmelite nun died 18 years earlier, leaving behind a mystical body of work still capable of baffling theologians. Teresa wrote about prayer as entering an inner castle and traversing its chambers to the core where God dwells. Barbara reads those pages, and something breaks within her, not with sadness but with recognition, as if someone had found words for something she carried without knowing how to name it. Soon after, it is said that Teresa of Avila appeared to her in a vision, asking her to bring the Reformed Carmelite order to France. France has no Carmelite convent in the Teresian style. Teresa wants that to change, and she wants Barbara to be the one to change it. Barbara Acari is not religious. She is a noble wife, a mother without vows, without habits, without any canonical authorization. That task belongs to a nun, a priest, a bishop, to anyone but her. How many people today feel that God is asking something that goes beyond all qualifications, all the time, all the available ability, that he asks precisely because you have no way to do it alone? Barbara begins. In 1602, the first vocations appear. She obtains permission from the king, and in 1603, authorization from Pope Clement VIII. St. Francis de Sales, her confessor and spiritual director, would say that he had rarely found a soul with such clarity about the will of God. On August 29, 1604, 6 Spanish Carmelites arrive in Paris. On October 17th, in the first Carmelite convent in France, monastic life begins. 3 of Barbara's daughters enter the convent. The order expands to Pontoise, Dijon, and Amiens. During the process, Barbara experiences public ecstasies at Mass, falls into a trance and is seen levitating. She continues her work. In 1613, Pedro died after 9 days of illness in the peace of the righteous. Barbara closed her husband's eyes with her hands. Free from all earthly duties, she made an unexpected decision. She did not enter the Carmelite order as a foundress. She entered as a lay sister, wearing a white veil, with a new name, Maria da Incarnation, a servant to the other sisters. She took her vows before one of her daughters, already an abbess. The most influential woman in Paris will be doing laundry and cooking. She suffers harsh treatment from a new prioress who doesn't know her. She has ecstatic experiences in the kitchen. She falls ill. In December of 1616, she is transferred to the Carmelite convent in Pontoise. There she dies reciting Psalms 21 and 111. It was April 18, 1618, a Holy Thursday. Pope Pius VI beatifies her on June 5, 1791. Her body remains buried in the chapel of Pontoise to this day. 3 eras, 3 worlds that don't touch each other at all. Imperial Rome, where the emperor's law decided who lived and who died. Medieval Milan, where the armies of the Holy Roman Empire could raze an entire city in an afternoon. Baroque Paris, where faith and politics intertwined in wars that lasted generations and ended with edicts of tolerance that tolerated very little. 3 people who, if they had met, would have had neither a common language nor a shared context. A Roman senator from the 2nd century, a Lombard cardinal from the 12th century, a Parisian noblewoman from the 17th century. What could Apollonius say to Galdino? What could Galdino say to Barbara? Nothing obvious. And yet, when you put the 3 stories side by side, a pattern emerges that is so precise that it seems impossible it could not have been woven by a hand operating outside of time. Each of them had a way out. A real reasonable way out, one that no one at the time would have criticized. Apollonius. A verbal formality, a public declaration of resignation that didn't necessarily mean anything internally. Galdino. To remain in exile in Rome, to coordinate from a distance to await better political conditions. A strategy entirely defensible for someone of 80 years old. Barbara. To enter the Carmelite order as the central figure everyone knew she was, to govern the convents she herself had built, to occupy the prestige that was objectively hers. None of the 3 chose the exit, not out of masochism, not out of indifference to suffering, but because each one understood, with a clarity that is somewhat frightening when viewed from the outside, that appearance and substance are radically different things, that there is a way to preserve one's name and lose one's life, that the real price of everything that matters is always paid in silence, far from those who will applaud. Apollonius paid with his blood, Galdino paid with his breath, the last word on his lips in the only place he wanted to be. Barbara paid with invisibility, the founder who ended up by her own choice in a kitchen. And then there's the date. April 18th appears in each story in a different way, in the martyrdom of Apollonius, in the consecration and death of Galdino, in the death of Barbara. 3 distinct milestones on a single date, separated by centuries. Is it coincidence or providence? What matters is what the 3 stories together say to those who hear them. Faith is not just what one believes, it is what one refuses to betray, even when betrayal would be much easier. After Apollonius died, Rome did not forget. The senators who were in the room on that 18th of April in the year 185 carried with them the silence that fell after he finished speaking. Many converted. Eusebius of Caesarea recorded the event in detail. Saint Jerome mentioned it in chapter 40 of his catalogue of illustrious men. The blood of the philosopher-senator was, as Christian tradition would say of every martyr, the seed of new Christians in Rome. His memory remained trapped for centuries in confusion with other saints of similar names, and therefore the correct date of his feast in the Roman martyrology was a point of debate among scholars. But the story survived. And today, whoever seeks in the catalogue of saints a patron for the intellectual defense of the faith, an intercessor for the moment when it is necessary to be Christian not only in words but in deed, finds Apollonius of Rome. The philosopher who won the argument and lost his life, and in doing so gained much more than any argument could have given. Galdino left Milan a different Milan than the one he found, not only rebuilt in stone and wood, but reorganized as a community of faith. His name entered the litany of the Ambrosian Rite, the liturgical form unique to Milan that has existed since the time of St. Ambrose in the 4th century, alongside Ambrose himself and St. Charles Borromeo, the two greatest names in Milanese ecclesiastical history. It is a companionship that is not offered by decree. It is recognition that the people of a city accumulate over generations and bestow upon a name. His relics were transferred in 1461 when the old cathedral of Santa Tecla was demolished. In 1578, Cardinal Charles Borromeo collected his remains along with other relics under the altar of the crypt. In 1940, Cardinal Alfredo Schuster recomposed and repositioned his remains under the altar dedicated to the Virgin in the Metropolitan Cathedral of Milan, where they remain. He is the patron saint of Lombardy. Barbara, who went down in history as Mary of the Incarnation, is still called the mother and founder of Carmel in France. The first Carmelite monastery she established gave rise to others, which gave rise to others, which crossed the Atlantic and reached other continents. Women who have never heard the name Barbara Avrillot live today in monasteries that exist because of the choices she made in 17th century Paris. His body rests in the chapel of the convent in Pontoise. Beatification took place on June 5, 1791, by Pope Pius VI, after a process that lasted 9 years. And April 18th was marked 3 times on the calendar of saints, a date that has been one of martyrdom, consecration, and last breath, a date chosen by chance or reserved for itself by providence. This story began in silence, the silence of the Roman Senate after Apollonius finished reading. A hall full of intelligent men, trained in the art of argument, before a man who had simply spoken the truth with all possible clarity and who did not know what to answer. Not because the truth convinced them to change their sentence, but because the clarity of that man disarmed them in a way that power cannot undo. Power can decree, it cannot refute. Now you know all 3 stories in their entirety. She saw Apollonius move from philosophy to faith, with the same seriousness with which he moved from faith to martyrdom. She saw Galdino endure exile, the destruction of the city, the death of the archbishop who was his mentor, and still return, clothed in a dignity that no emperor had managed to demolish along with the buildings. She saw Barbara fight in court, raise children, found convents, and then at the moment when all this could finally earn her a place of honor, disappear into a cloister kitchen by her own choice. 3 refusals, 3 ways of saying the same thing, that faith is not an ornament. It is not something added when life is in order. It is the core from which everything else is organized, and whose price, when demanded, is always paid in real currency. 18 centuries have passed since the 18th of April, 185, a little over 850 since the 18th of April, 1176, a little over 400 since the 18th of April, 1618, and even today, somewhere in the world, someone is facing a similar choice. Not in the dramatic sense of the Roman Senate, but in the everyday sense, that is, in most lives, where true decisions of faith are made. What to say when it would be easier not to say anything. What to refuse when accepting would cost less. What to rebuild when destroying is more convenient. What to give up when keeping it would be safer. When that time comes, there is now an invisible companion, a senator who discovered in philosophy the path to the gospel, a bishop who was born twice on the same day and died with his last word on his lips, a mother who founded the most famous contemplative center in France and chose to be invisible within it. 3 people who never met, who lived in different languages, cities, and centuries that had nothing in common, and who, for reasons that transcend any historical explanation, deposited their memory on a single day, on the 18th of April. That is today.